What's going on, guys? It's History Obscured, and today I'm going to be going over the Maroons. Alright, now, reason why I'm going over the Maroons today is because when we think about slavery, a lot of the time we think about oppression and the gruesome atrocities that blacks had to face under European rule. But what is not really spoken about is the demographic of slaves that set up communities in outlaw areas and remote regions throughout the Caribbean that could not be penetrated by the Europeans due to their skill in warfare and defense in their military strategies to fight against European domination. Alright, so again, the Maroons, in my eyes, to a degree, were extremely legendary, and it's unique to hear about a demographic of slaves that were not defeated by Europeans, because that's not something that's actually taught in Western society, whether we're talking about education or film. All right. Now, throughout the time of the Spanish conquest under Christopher Columbus, the Spanish dominated the Caribbean heavily until the year 1655, when British colonial powers fought against the Spanish and overthrew them. Okay, now the British, they were more vicious when it came to subjugating the slaves on the island. All right, but again, like I said before, the Maroons were skilled in war to the point where they could not be defeated by Europeans. All right, which actually led to them creating peace treaties just to have some level of power over the slaves. All right, but we're going to get into all of this, okay? So anyway, going back to the Maroons, the Maroon settlements were outlaw communities that were created by Negroes and Native Indians. All right, so again, for many of the Native Indians that suffered under European domination, a lot of them died in large numbers. All right, we're talking about the millions, because a lot of them could not withstand the disease, the oppression, and the violence that they suffered under European domination. Okay, but this also went against the slave owners in regards to having slaves to labor on their plantations. So what happened was they started to import African slaves to the Caribbean who were able to withstand the same oppressions that the natives faced without dying in high numbers that the natives were dying in. Okay, hence why you had Africans being transported to the Caribbean in the first place. Okay, now again, these communities that were set up in these outlaw areas throughout the Caribbean comprised of Negro and Indian slaves, okay, that created alliances with one another to create these independent societies. All right, now again, these regions were set up in places that were hard for Europeans to penetrate, hence why you don't read anywhere in history where European colonial powers defeated the Maroons when it came to physical war. You don't read about that, okay, because they weren't. All right, now when we look at the purpose of why these Maroons set up these communities, the whole purpose of why they did it was for obvious reasons, was to separate themselves from any form of European influence or domination. They were set up mainly to create independent communities where they had the freedom to set up their own communities that would push their own moral codes and their religion, okay, and to execute justice fairly, because these weren't things that were taking place on the plantations that they were enslaved on. Okay, now in saying that, not all Maroon societies live by strong moral codes, and this is more so making reference to the smaller Maroon communities that were just living like fugitives and living just on a day-to-day, just trying to survive, but they didn't really have much structure in relation to the larger Maroon communities. Okay. Again, these Maroon colonies were unstable due to the fact that their only thought was to push violence, all right, and to really just cause havoc, all right, without any objective. And eventually, these smaller Maroon communities became decimated after a while due to that. Okay, but many of the Maroon settlements that lived by strong moral standards, which were the larger Maroon colonies, established a successful government of independence. Okay, and part of this, all right, comprised of educating the young, so setting up an educational system where they had the liberty to teach the young. Okay, they also had the freedom to practice their own religion and execute justice. All right. But one of the key factors that made Maroon society successful was the practice of agriculture. Okay. And this mainly came from the Africans that were transported to the Caribbean. They played a big part in agriculture because they were knowledgeable in that. And they also used that skill and taught it to their Indian neighbors. Okay, so there were strong alliances with Black and Indian Maroons, and there was a lot of respect because they both had a common enemy and they both had similar moral codes even prior to them coming in contact on the same island. And the reason why that is, right, is because the Blacks and the Indians are the same people. All right. When Christopher Columbus made his expedition to the Americas, and he was writing letters back to the king and queen of Spain, he mentioned that the Indians on in the Americas look exactly the same as the Blacks in Spain and Portugal. They look like Negroes, basically. All right. So, and that's what they were. But the Europeans give them that name Indian to cause confusion, to make you think that Africans and Indians were different demographic or race. All right. Now, much of the agriculture was done by the Africans who taught Indians, and the great skill of agriculture reflected the success of Maroon communities. All right. Okay. So, the food cultivated by the Maroons, all right, superseded what the Europeans created. All right. And the Europeans knew this. And this played a big part in the reason why the Maroons were able to sustain good diets and were able to maintain strong physiques. All right. Their agricultural methods actually played a big part in the reason why they were able to fight against Europeans with such skill and such strength. All right. And that was I say it again, that was a strong factor that contributed to the success of Maroon communities. Okay. Now, when we look at the order and the structure of these larger Maroon communities, leadership was a big thing. All right. To become or to be recognized as a Maroon leader, there needed to be strong leadership skills in relation to moral principles that were being applied in various Maroon communities. All right. To maintain discipline in order to handle external threats, which were the European powers, obviously. All right. When we look at acts such as robbery, murder, adultery, these were punishable acts, all right, that were often done in public. And again, it was done to maintain discipline amongst various Maroon societies, so they didn't lose the discipline that will cause them to overthrow the European colonial enemies. Okay, so that was a strong thing that the Maroons stood by. Okay, now when we look at all of this, all right, one of the main reasons why the Maroons were even called Maroons, okay, was to degrade them. All right. Now, with everything that I just mentioned concerning their conduct, frame of mind, the way that they conducted themselves as a subgroup, all right, of runaway slaves, the European powers weren't happy about this. Hence why the term Maroon was given onto them as a derogatory, a degrading term that was coined on them, all right, to make us look at them like they were less than, when really and truly they were an organized subgroup that set these communities, which made it hard for European colonial powers to penetrate. All right. Now, the term Maroon was not given. They did not go by the term Maroon. All right. That was a byword that was given onto them. And, it's no different than the term Moor, Negro, Morisco. These terms were given onto blacks based on either their identity or certain characteristics that they were observed to have. And obviously, being a runaway slave, if that's the term that you're going to go by based on how Europeans view you, then that's how you're going to be defined, okay? But that does not mean that that's what they were identified by. And I'll give you an example. A strong demographic of Maroons, all right, known as Jamaican Maroons, or better yet, Coromantee Maroons, were a vicious subgroup that were known for creating terror amongst British colonial powers especially. They were known to be vicious, and they were frightening, and they caused a lot of hell for British colonial powers, okay? But the whole point of why I'm bringing that out is because they were known as Coromantee Jews, who were Ghanaian captives that were transported from Africa to the Caribbean, okay? And they actually played a big part, which actually led to the first Maroon War in 1728, all right? Which actually ran through a whole decade, which then led to peace treaties being created by the British to have them in some form of subjugation. Okay, that's how skillful these slaves were. So this is not a thing where these slaves were just out here running away for their life and they were organized. No, they created organized communities and they were skilled fighters. All right. Now, the Maroons in the larger islands of the Caribbean were able to sustain their communities through hunting, growing crops, and agriculture, like I mentioned before. Okay, but agriculture is what really made them who they were. Okay, and this played a big part in their survival. Okay, because you have to also think the only way that they could have survived was through having those agricultural skills, which allowed them to cultivate their crops freely. All right, without that, they would have died. They would have not been able to survive, all right, against those European powers. Okay, so there was a lot of characteristics and attributes that they had that worked in their favor, that contributed to them fighting off European powers. Okay. Now, as more runaway slaves escaped plantations and joined Maroon communities, guerrilla warfare was taken to a new height. All right, that was basically their most prominent war strategy that was used to fight against British colonial powers, guerrilla warfare, and they were masterminds at it. And that's one of the main reasons why the British couldn't overcome them. Okay. As well as, these Maroons burning plantations and poisoning slavers, the guerrilla war tactic was the main war strategy that gave them that advantage against their opponents. Okay. Now, these acts of the Maroons, right? These valiant and brave acts of the Maroons struck fear in their white enslavers, okay? Mainly the British again, because the British, when they came into power, Their whole aim was to subjugate the Caribbean, all right? And their main objective was to go for those Maroon slaves first, okay? That was their main aim. But again, they could not figure out how to conquer them, and they spent large amounts of money to support them in their resources to get rid of the Maroon communities and to subjugate those runaway slaves. But it was to no avail, because these Maroons had a strong mindset that nothing would stop them from preventing them from going back to slavery again. They were so strong in that belief that they were willing to put their lives on the line just to make sure that they didn't go back and revisit those old experiences that they once suffered under. Okay, and that's what made them a difficult demographic to conquer. Okay, now again, there were many Maroon communities that were set up throughout the Caribbean. All right, the term Maroon doesn't just focus on one set of people that created outlaw communities. These outlaw communities were set up throughout the Caribbean. So you had many different Maroon groups, like I mentioned before. All right, but the Maroon group I want to focus on, right, are the Jamaican Maroons, okay, which we're gonna get into. Okay, now the continuous wars with the British led to the first Maroon War in 1728. Okay, due to the British failing to conquer the Jamaican Maroons, they were forced to sign treaties in 1739 to 1740. Okay, now when you look at the time spectrum from 1728 all the way to 1739, that's over a decade where you have the British trying to subjugate these Jamaican Maroons that fought in the first Maroon War against the British. Okay, but the British could not subjugate them. So that's what led to them creating treaties to basically figure out a way on how they could control the Caribbean without Maroon disturbance or interference. Okay. Now the main two subgroups, right, were the Leeward and Windward Maroons. The Windward was run by her name was called the Nanny of the Maroons. Okay, so she was a prominent leader that was over the Windward Maroons. Okay, she led that military army against the British. She played a big part in that. And then you also had the Leeward Maroons that was also run by Cujo and Akompong. Okay, these were Coromantee slaves that came in as Ghanaian captives, all right, that set up these communities amongst themselves, and they were known to be vicious fighters. These were the specific main Maroon groups that were given treaties by the British because the British couldn't handle the madness that they were bringing to them. They were fierce with it. Okay. Now, when we look at the peace treaties, Europeans especially are known for not keeping any of their treaties or not having a sense of fairness when it comes to the treaties that they were set up, all right, and that were also given to the Maroons. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this. The peace treaty signed by the Maroons was an agreement that disbanded any runaway slave joining any outlaw Maroon communities. Okay, so their whole point of setting up these treaties was to basically destroy any form of alliance or movement that would continue the growth of Maroon communities. So it really went against the objectives that these Maroon communities were trying to create. Okay. Part of the treaty, all right, was to assist in capturing runaway slaves and sending them back to the plantations. Now, this is where I feel the Maroon legacy was tainted because of the fact that they agreed to these conditions, all right? So you're talking about a strong, powerful movement of black runaway slaves that have created communities to fight against oppression, to now reversing it and catching any runaway slave and giving them back to the same people that are oppressing you concerning your freedom. All right. And again, I do understand it to a degree because you don't want to continuously fight for your life. You know, you want some level of peace, but at the same time, I feel, to me reading that history, I feel that there's some copping out. All right. In terms of it being true or the level of reliability when it comes to that information, I can't really speak on it, but it was known that these peace treaties that were created was accepted by these Maroon colonies. All right. And these treaties were definitely not in favor of these Maroons. Okay, it was one-sided and it was meant to cause a some form of defeat, I would say, to subjugate the Maroon societies. Okay, and that's where I feel the legacy again was tainted. All right, but at the same time, one thing I can confirm is that these Maroon communities that were set up were not defeated by Europeans, and that's something that you will not hear in this Western society. Okay, you don't really read about these things. Okay, but the importance of knowing this history gives you a sense of other events aside from the atrocities that slaves had to face. All right, it shows you that there were other background stories where slaves could not be defeated or captured by white enslavers. Okay, and that's the main reason why I went over this history today, to show the audience that it wasn't always like that. All right, there were slave communities that were not conquered. Okay, and this is something that, you know, if you didn't know, now you know, and it's good to read more upon it so you can get a better understanding of the experiences concerning what the Maroons had to go through just to fight off oppression from British colonial powers. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to go into too much. I hope that you gained a lot from the video. All right, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more content. And yeah, man, you know, support the channel. And yeah, I got much more content coming. All right, so that's it from me. I'm going to leave it there. It's History Obscured. Peace.